Hello everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another modern video. And it's going to be super important that you really emphasize the term modern video because of the deck that we're going to be looking at this week for modern. And as diverse of a metagame as modern has proven to be, with some decks just quickly rising to the top that existed in previous formats, aka like before bannings and things like that. We have other decks too that just seem to come out of nowhere, either getting new tools to kind of help combat the metagame at large or just become top tier decks because of the other decks that end up coming into the foray of the modern metagame. So while we are sick and tired of it probably in the Pioneer format, this version of this deck has found a way to exist in modern and is seeing a pretty sizable share in the metagame right now. So today we're going to be taking a look at the Rakdos midrange deck for modern and just see what kind of tools it has to work with to essentially combat the 5-color midrange decks and some of the other combo slash aggro decks that are in the format. So without further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at the deck. So here we have the Rakdos midrange deck piloted by Omar Gambari of the Legacy European Tour qualifier at Magic Time Ravenna to a first place finish. Before I really get too deep into it, this Rakdos midrange deck is also kind of referred to as Scam. Uh, for exactly what reason, I'm not sure. I will kind of give like my own theories without really even looking up why it's called that. But before we get too deep into all that, I would just appreciate it if you have not already subscribed to the channel. Then you go ahead and subscribe to the channel. I make modern videos like this. I like to do in-depth deck guides and some other random type videos that have to do with maybe the modern format or the Pioneer format, along with Pioneer deck text and things like that, with hopefully a more normalized schedule coming next week. So be on the lookout for that. There is a link in the description of the videos as well to join the Discord server if that is something that interests you. Talk about modern and Pioneer and things like that, share deck lists and all that fun stuff. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at Rakdos Scam. It's a deck that has a few avenues to victory, and a lot of them revolve around like grief and fury and some of these like feign death type cards. So as you know, grief and fury both have an additional cost of exiling a red card or a black card respectively from your hand, and then when they enter they give some kind of effect. So what typically ends up happening is like, say for grief, you're going to make your opponent reveal their hand. You're going to choose a card from it, and they're going to discard that card. The evoke trigger is still going to be on the stack. Then you respond by casting either a Feign Death, a Malakir Rebirth, an Undying Evil, Undying Malice, and that's it. Cool. There's like a ton of these cards that have different effects. Feign Death in particular just has when until end of turn, target creature gains when this creature dies, returns to the battlefield tapped under its own control with +1/+1 counter. Undying Evil gives the creature undying until end of turn, which will make the creature come back with a +1/+1 counter. Undying Malice, essentially the same thing. When a creature dies on the battlefield tapped under its owner's control, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So all these except for Malakir Rebirth let you return the creature with a +1/+1 counter. Obviously, getting to double up on the or double up on the ETB trigger. So grief being the worst of the two because obviously Fury having double strike, being a 4/4 with double strike will end the game super quickly. But basically getting to double up on these, grief having the most immediate impact, and I think making it a lot harder to deal with, especially on the play turn one. You just get to take your opponent's two best cards, and you have a four power menacer that will, even if they can play a threat on turn one, they cannot profitably block it. Where Fury obviously just gets chump blocked by a lot of the other things that your opponent could be playing. Uh, but you do have some ways to mitigate getting rid of some of your opponent's like chump blockers and things like that. So Dauthi Voidwalker being a pretty good one just to have in the format. Getting to resolve this on the play, like against some of the living end players that are still floating around, against like the Yawgmoth deck and things like that. This card is just a house. If cards put in your opponent's graveyard from anywhere, it gets exiled with a void counter on it, and you can of course tap and sacrifice Dauthi Voidwalker to cast a card with a void counter on it without paying its mana cost. Also has shadow, so it cannot be blocked, or it can only block and be blocked by creatures with shadow, which is going to be opposing Dauthi Voidwalkers if you're playing the mirror. So Voidwalker, we've seen the crazy things where like the Dream, where like you play against Tron and like they have an Emrakul and you cast an Emrakul and things like that. But Dauthi Voidwalker plays two roles, and really none of them have to do with like the tap sacrifice. One just kind of benefits from it. Obviously, just being a very aggressive creature, 2 mana 3/2 is pretty impressive considering that we have a 4 mana 3/2 in our deck that we are basically trying to combine another card plus exiling a card from our hand to play. So the fact that Dauthi Voidwalker is essentially near unblockable, doesn't care about the number of creatures your opponent plays, just basically cares that another Dauthi Voidwalker in play. This can get really aggressive, it gets into the red zone super easily. And also, if your opponent is a graveyard based deck, this card just kind of hoses them that way because then they have to deal with the Voidwalker. And even if they are able to deal with a Voidwalker, like if you're not attacking with it or anything like that, you can just cash it in for another card as well. Um, Conversely, the one drop slot, we have Ragavan, which is a card that the format has been wrapped around and really warped around answering really since the card was printed in Modern Horizons 2. Can end the game sort of kind of on its own, maybe not necessarily the card itself, but just the amount of value that it generates for 1 mana versus maybe what your opponent has to end up doing to get rid of it. Ragavan is, of course, just one of the most powerful cards that you can play in the format, and basically a requirement essentially to play modern if you're not playing like Living End or like Rhinos or things like that. Running out like the creatures in the deck, you have Kroxa and you have Seasoned Pyromancer. Kroxa is basically just like a mana sake in the late game. Like you have all these like cheap spells and things like that. Kroxa is just a card that you can get back, continue to put more pressure on your opponent's life total and on their hand as well. Very hard for their opponent to deal with like Grief on turn one and then like bringing back a Grief and then getting to Kroxa them and just getting them to discard 3 cards on top of possibly playing a land and maybe playing like their own 1 mana spell and things like that. So definitely a good late game card to kind of clean up. Not too bad in the early game as well. You also have cards like Seasoned Pyromancer that let you put cards into your bin, create 1/1s, and then another mana sake later in the game. These kind of help you find some of your other spells, like it helps you find like your one of Kolaghan's Command, some of your removal spells like Terminate. Can even get you some copies of Blood Moon as well. That can sometimes just get your opponent, even though they maybe are aware of it, maybe it's on their radar, but still, there's some people that just can't afford to play around it. You play it, and more than likely, you just end the game right there. But you'd end up playing like 5 or 6 more turns until they're actually dead. Looking at the spells, of course, we have cards like Feign Death, the Malakir Rebirth, Undying Evil, Undying Mouse, things like that to return your ephemeral creatures or your elementals back to the battlefield if you evoke them. You can even do it like defensively on some of your other creatures just to make them a little bit harder to deal with. And with a lot of them gaining a buff, I mean, a 4-power Voidwalker or even like a Ragavan with like 3 power is pretty good, especially if your opponent expends a lot of resources trying to get rid of said cards. Of course, you have cards like Lightning Bolt that are just kind of versatile in getting to deal with like planeswalkers and other like creatures and things like that. Of course, in a pinch can go to the face. Another deck that really doesn't necessarily want Unholy Heat because it can't reliably trigger the Delirium on said card. Three Thoughtseize just as a disruptive element. Again, like you could like Thoughtseize your opponent on turn one if you're worried about like counter spells or even worried about like solitudes and things like that. Be able to get rid of that and then just pick off, you know, pick off your opponent's hand by griefing and then bringing it back with one of your various rebirth effects or like Fury to like deal with your opponent's board or just to get a fast clock into play as well. You have like one of Night's Whisper, you have an Aghanim Awakening, and Kolaghan's Command. Kolaghan's Command is just very versatile, getting you to pick up one of like your Grief or your Fury. Heck, even getting like a Ragavan or a Dauthi Voidwalker is totally fine with this. The flexibility of dealing 2 damage, shattering an artifact in a format where Hammer Time is still a popular deck that people want to play. The 2 damage also being relevant in killing off a lot of like their threats. And discarding a card as well is just a way to like disrupt their draw step if they're empty-handed going into their turn. Aghadim's Awakening, you can pretty feasibly build up to a lot of mana, and like you can bring back just about everything up the curve. You play this for like X equals 5, so you can get back a Fury, a Grief, a Pyromancer, a Voidwalker, and a Ragavan. and that's just going to be really good, especially for like 8 mana. That's a lot of pressure to be putting into play, and a lot of triggers happening when that happens as well. You have Nice Whisper, just a very efficient draw two, lose two, just as a way to kind of feel back up after kind of putting yourself down in cards by Grief plus Fury Evoke with one of our various rebirth effects. Of course, Blood Moon, we know, can instantly win the game. You're a deck that doesn't necessarily care about Blood Moon, so you're able to kind of play this with minimal drawback and just really get people when they least expect it. The mana base, another one that's kind of super simple. You have Blackleaf Cliffs as an early untapped land that doesn't cause you any damage. You have various amounts of swamps because again we are a Blood Moon deck. One mountain to fetch up if you need to. The Takenuma to get back one of our various like creatures. Marsh Flats and Bloodstained Mires just as our black fetch lands, since getting swamps are going to be the most important lands for us to get in a pinch. And of course, two Blood Crypt as a another two lands that we can fetch up that will give us both colors into play untapped when we need it. Again, also just a dual that will come into play untapped as well. You have like the sideboard. You have engineer explosives mainly for I'm going to say like the rhinos matchups and things like that. That's kind of like one of the more popular decks in the format. So definitely having explosives for their tokens is pretty good. Fatal pushes as well for like opposing Ragavans and even like Rhino tokens and things like that. Surgical Extraction, not a card that you really see seeing play honestly in the format anymore. So kind of cool to see it. Definitely a way that you can get some of the other Cascade decks as well as any of the other like graveyard-based strategies, and just kind of thin out their deck and get rid of some of their payoffs and make them play an honest, fair game of Magic, because that is what we're doing here. Abrade, just another shatter effect slash removal, just gives you some more flexibility in the main deck. Collective Brutality, a way that you can kind of like pitch some of the cards in a graveyard to get some additional modes on it, but any one of these modes for 2 mana is okay. Get to a point where you can get 2 or even 3 of them is going to be pretty good for you. Turok basically really gets around playing against Solitude. Also getting up to 4 mana and kicking it and getting your opponent to discard 2 random cards. Growing the Turok can either get to a point where your opponent is hellbent and they are basically trying to top deck an answer, where you put this threatening clock on them, or getting them to discard 2 random cards can like make them discard 2 lands and they end up missing a land drop. Unlicensed Hearse and to a point Hitsugu definitely have ways of messing with the graveyard. Hearse getting to just be this big card that even if your opponent doesn't necessarily have key pieces that you want to exile, Hearse does just get big through naturally playing the game. So eventually, like your smaller creatures are gonna be able to crew this Hearse that's gonna be an 8/8 and put your opponent to the abyss every turn. Hitsugu Consumes All is like another card that I would say is pretty good against like the hammer matchups and things like that. On top of that, like something that you could feasibly bring in against graveyard decks with its second ability. And of course, like on the other side, it is a creature that can put a clock on your opponent. Magus and Necromentia. Magus just being another Blood Moon type effect, this time in creature form, and Necromentia again being kind of against those like Cascade decks and things like that, just as other tools. I mean, you can play this in like against Tron, any deck that's just kind of like trying to assemble a pretty ABC type game plan. Necromentia can come in, kind of disrupt that and force them to either respect it in game three, assuming that we get to a game three, or just completely hose them and make it very hard for them to come out from underneath of it and win the game. So that's Rakdos Midrange or Rakdos Scam, however you would prefer it. The deck is, of course, very well. It's very powerful in what it gets to do while also getting to play a relatively honest and fair game plan if it doesn't have Grief or Fury plus Feign Death, Rebirth, Undying Evil, Undying Malice, so on and so forth. So definitely a deck to watch out for because this deck is gaining a lot of popularity. I would imagine that is very good against some of the other like counterspell decks. Even I could see against like being really good against creativity. Again, just being able to thought seize your opponent twice, especially on a deck that wants to combo off on like turn four, and having all these different ways to discard and put pressure on your opponent is definitely a recipe for success in just about any Eternal format, and Rakdos Midrange is no different. Definitely a deck worth trying out. Definitely a deck worth playing and keeping an eye out for as we kind of expand on the modern metagame and kind of figure out exactly where like the 4-color elementals deck is now that Yorian's banned and all that fun stuff. So if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more videos like this, of course, leave a like on the video and of course, subscribe to the channel if you have not already so you can see more videos like this. Of course, follow the link in the Discord, follow the link in the description of the video down below to go to the Discord server so we can talk about decks like this or trends in Modern, Pioneer, etc., so on and so forth. I just like talking about Magic. Super sweet game, and obviously there's something that always keeps bringing me back to it. And yeah, that's going to do it for me in this video. I hope you all enjoyed, and I hope to see you all in the next one.